recent solo exhibitions at Suyana Space, Seattle, Washington, Roswell Art Museum, Roswell, New Mexico, Nancy Margolis Gallery, New York, and the Portland Museum of Art. In 2010, she won the Maud Morgan Prize for Best Solo Exhibition in Sculpture at the New England Art Award. Her work is in numerous public collections, including the National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C., Tate Gallery, London, Library of Congress, Washington, D.C., Portland Museum of Art, Maine, Anderson Museum of Contemporary Art, Roswell, New Mexico, Bowdoin College, Brunswick, Maine, Mills College, Oakland, California, Oberlin College, Oberlin, Ohio, University of Vermont, Burlington, University of Wisconsin-Madison, the Cordova Museum and Sculpture Park, Lincoln, Massachusetts, and Wesley College, Wesley, Massachusetts. Without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Anna. Anna, welcome.
Thank you.
Yay!
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to see so many of you taking time to come to this. I really appreciate it. You know, I used to teach, as Demir said, and since stopping teaching now for 4+ years ago, I don't have all that many opportunities in my life to sit down and reflect in language about my work. So it's, even though I dread it, it's a great opportunity, and I'm really grateful to have this chance to be here and to try to draw some thoughts together for you. I've never given the same talk twice, so I try to speak to what is most immediate to me right now. So since yesterday morning and the real forming of this talk, I have basically some very simple thoughts to share with you today. So I'm going to talk a little bit philosophically about sort of what feels important to me right now. And then I want to emphasize printmaking in this talk, in particular, because of the invitation from Demir, and I know I'm going to be meeting with a lot of you who are taking printmaking this afternoon. So there's going to be an unnatural leaning to printmaking in this talk, but I'll show a scattering of other things as well. I love this image. This is my sort of keystone for the talk. And my most simple, immediate message that I feel right now from the studio is that you really can't know anything in the creative process. You just can't. Our lives are in constant flux. Our curiosities, our interests are constantly changing underfoot. We all pretend otherwise, but this is just the way it goes. And so I feel like all I can do is to cultivate strength through a sort of flexibility, I guess, and so that I'm more capable of encountering the unknown with a certain kind of awareness, or just being in the present in an active way. And I feel like this is really what being in the studio is all about. Now, saying that, I'm not usually capable of doing that, but this is sort of what I aspire to, okay? So this is this kind of risk-taking state of mind, and being in the present with some sort of a process. So I love this image because it makes me think of that incredibly treacherous but kind of beautiful hanging on the balance between all these elements in your life, and somehow taking that risk to confront the unknown, which is what it always feels like to me anyway, in the studio, and do it with a certain amount of grace or patience or something like that. You know, I had this great opportunity when I was in my late 20s to go and live in South Korea for a year, and it was an amazing year. My Korean is horrible. My closest friends there, their English was horrible, and it was a year where communication happened in a really different way. But I made this really wonderful friend there, Lee Jin-gyung, who's a painter. She lives outside of Seoul, and she would always say to me, and I didn't know what to think of it at the time, but she would always say to me, Anna, you know, we have a party we party for a while, and then maybe we make art. You know, this was sort of her philosophy, like to be so playful in relation to what you're making in the studio. And the older I get, I feel like the more I understand kind of how amazing it is, what she was telling me, that what seems the most frivolous, it seems the most serious as bedfellows in a certain way. So again, like these moments where all of your making is kind of happening in the periphery, where you're not facing your projects as a rational set of logistical concerns, but things kind of happen, you know, on the edges of your intention. And I feel like, you know, partying for 3 days and then making art would really set the stage for that. So I love that. I love that whole idea. And I think in some way as well, the reason that I continue going to the studio all the time and making things is because it really is the best way I know to be in the present. And I think it's the only chance I have, in a weird way, of being in the present. So it's a great thing for those rare and passing seconds when I can make that happen. So what I want to talk about in the first part of this lecture is a project I did in the spring of 2009 called Carving the Floors. And I want to talk about it because it's sort of a feat of printmaking, which is fun to address, but also because it, I think, illustrates some of the ideas that I'm talking about here in terms of facing sort of the unknown with a certain amount of flexibility and an unknown outcome for sure in terms of that process. So this was a very instructive and wonderful project for me. This is the Brunswick High School. I was teaching at Bowdoin College at the time, and they were demolishing this building because it had a mold problem. And we realized very quickly that in all of the classrooms there were these wonderful wooden floors, and that perhaps the advanced printmaking group, there were I guess like 12 of us, and myself, we could maybe go in and carve those floors as gigantic wood blocks. So the classrooms were about 20 by 30 feet, each of them. And so we were working under a tremendous amount of time pressure, but the advanced printmaking group took one classroom, and then I worked in the classroom next door collaborating with my friend Andrea Salzer. And the two of us did a big print there. So a few process shots to show you. This was obviously a collaboration between 12 people. The floors were maple, which is really hard to carve for those of you who have done carving in wood. And we used every kind of tool, routers, you know, traditional chisels, a chainsaw, you know, automatic U-gouges and V-gouges. We used everything we could think about, starting out with ink drawings, which you see sort of the remains of on there, and then the actual carving. I think I have a detail that just shows some of it. And we were going through, you know, years of varnish, trying to get down to the wood as well. But very beautiful to turn these old floors into a print. And in printing it, we used roll stock. I think it was about 40 inches wide of kozo, a Japanese paper, and we printed in long strips. And you know, you can't fit a floor through a press, so we did it all using wooden spoons in big groups. So we'd ink it up, and it was quite a day working on those floors. This is next door. That's Andrea Salzer making some marks in our floor. So just so you can see the different quality of the room next door. But it was the same exact size. Everything else was sort of analogous. So back to this idea of kind of working with this tremendous unknown. I had never collaborated with Andrea before. This was our first chance to do it. We were working under extraordinary time pressure because the town had to have someone on duty while we were there, plus class was only 2 hours or whatever it was. So literally in one day we made the drawing, in maybe 2 or 3 sessions we carved it, and then in 1 day we printed it. So it was like each session had a kind of intensity, just having to work with these time frames and these circumstances, but it pushed along a process, you know, with less thinking, which is usually a good idea, I found, for me anyway. So we were using tools we had never used before. We were working on a scale we didn't know how it was going to work, how it was going to print, what was going to be happening. This is just an image of the printing in process. You can see we just recruited everybody around the paper, and it was kind of there's music blaring, which you can't appreciate from this, and it was pretty fun in the end, just to get so incredibly dirty all at once. And pulling up pieces of the print. That's the back side of the paper that you see there. The ink really came through because it was a fairly thin but very durable sheet. And you can see that floor kind of coming together. And then I have just a little video of us hoisting it. We ended the semester, sorry, the sound is not important. We ended the semester with a show at Space Gallery in Portland, and we had the group print on one wall, and Andrea and I had our print on the opposite wall, sort of facing each other. And we had dry mounted all the strips of paper together. This was the first moment that we saw it kind of as a thing on the wall, and you can see it was so big that we couldn't actually show the full print, so it was rolled up at the bottom. But it was just, there was something otherworldly about, you know, collaborating with someone to produce something that was so unexpected and so large. This was the student print unrolled on the floor so you could see the full surface. And what was so incredible about this experience, I think we all have inherited a lot of baggage about authorship and originality and, you know, all of that. And for these students to have collaborated, I mean, it was a struggle, and there were some really hard moments. But in the end, there was such a shared feeling of pride about this effort. And, you know, you couldn't even pick out your marks from other people's marks at a certain point, because everyone had roved across the whole surface, applying a certain texture or a certain idea. That was at least how they approached it. So it had a really powerful impact, I think, for everybody who worked on it. And this is sort of standing back the print that Andrea and I did in that very short amount of time. By the way, don't hesitate to ask me questions as I'm doing this talk, okay? We'll have questions afterwards too, but if things come up specific to a process or something, I'm happy to answer them. So, so back to my key image here. From an experience like that, which was so wholly kind of unexpected in terms of what was going to be happening, of course, it gave me the confidence to think about printmaking in my own work on a much larger scale. And so I had this opportunity to do a show at Suyama Space in Seattle. This was, I guess, the summer of 2011, I'm pretty sure. And I wanted to have a very simple show where I simply showed a 3D and a 2D version of the same thing, almost like a blueprint and then an actual structure existing in conversation with each other. What you can't appreciate from this image, which has a really strange color, is that the inflatable part was in constant motion. So it only achieved that shape that you see it at right there after it was, you know, blown full of air, and then the blower would shut off, and for that one moment it was off the ground, and then the whole thing would collapse and it would actually rest on the ground. So it was, I felt like the print was some sort of idealized version of like the actual sculpture, the sculpture being kind of messy and alive and a little menacing, and then the print being just very still and kind of contemplative. And I really love the conversation between these two parts. So I have a little, just a short, very short, is maybe 1 minute, of just the making of the blocks for that project. This is Luan, which is just the cheapest thing I could find, on the floor and in the Roswell Museum of Art, where I decided to turn the gallery into a studio for the making of this work as my show there. And I'm just carving the block. Similarly, when I was there, I collaborated with a group of friends and volunteers to do the printing by hand with spoons, exactly the same way that you just saw for the Carving the Floors project that I did in Brunswick. And basically the print was 2 of these blocks, huge blocks carved, and then stacked one over the other. One of the flowers is a little bit bigger than the other. I don't know if that's evident. You can see a little bit of the ghost of one of these explosions, whatever you want to call it, behind the other. And this one is about 16 feet in diameter. So it's much smaller than what we did in Brunswick. It felt, easy after doing that. But I loved how the one experience really pushed forward the possibility for another. And here, again, is just the print and the sculpture side by side.
So the sculpture will deflate and then inflate
Yes.
and deflate and
Yes.
deflate. Okay.
Right, yeah. So every 30 minutes, the blower would kick on, and it would lift the arms of the big explosion, basically, until it lifted off the ground. And then it would shut off, and then the whole form would fall again. So as is common in my process, I work between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions all the time. I feel like it's another one of those ways that I can disrupt a feeling of familiarity or formula, for sure, in relation to my work. So, plus I'm never sure what's more interesting, So if you make something like, let's say, this inflatable, which I just made with packing tape and plastic bags from the grocery store, I really love the lines and the sort of incidental marks of the structure of that thing, but I also love that it has this life of its own where it's constantly, deflating, like a funny personality. But then if I just chart the tape itself, as I did on this print, not of this particular one, but of another inflatable, are those decisions interesting to see as a separate kind of document of the process? I don't know. So I love to work through a process going from one to the other. Sometimes it feels more important than other times. I feel like right now I don't see any reason to make 2-dimensional images, actually. And I have a lot that I want to do in 3 dimensions. But sometimes it feels like a very natural and important part of the process to look at the back and forth between those 2 things, and to never be sure which, if anything, is worthwhile. I'm never sure. Just more of these fun inflatables. And a big one that I did, this was 24 feet in diameter. This was at the Kohler, John Michael Kohler Art Center in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, as part of a show there. When was that? It doesn't matter. But it did the same thing. So it lifted off the floor when it was full and came to settle there. So in these pairings, I'm gonna show you a series of couplets, I guess, of a 2-dimensional and a 3-dimensional thing side by side. In photography, of course, it's all 2-dimensional, and it becomes very blurry, like what's 2-dimensional and what's 3-dimensional. In the studio, it's a little bit more clear. And maybe it's because of having to document your work all the time that you come to this natural translation. That would make sense for me. So on the left is a wire sculpture that I did just this last winter, and on the right is a photogravure. So that's an intaglio print from a couple of years ago. And those were not necessarily in relation to each other. And I actually, let me just go back to that for a second, because I really love these latticed forms and being able to see through something transparently, but sort of be able to see it as a solid form at the same time. And how, as you walk around something or rotate something that has that transparency, it's kind of a feast for the eyes, the way that you are constantly recognizing both its transparency and its form. So I've done a number of sculptures that I think play with that idea. This was one called Arrest Array, and it's made from PVC discs that are joined by aluminum rods. And I've done a couple different versions of this. The most recent one is a permanent sculpture at the University of New Hampshire in Durham. If you're ever there, their new College of Business and Economics has one of these hanging in a big sort of hall. And I just love this pointillist, something that's very hard to appreciate from a photograph, but the way in which the dots recede and come forward depending on where you are against the form. And then a piece that was at the Portland Museum of Art in 2010 called The Great Hall. And to backtrack just a little bit while this is up on the screen, I think some of the ways in which I've found for myself that I can more easily achieve a kind of serendipitous state of mind. One of the ways is to alter the scale of what you're doing so much that you feel dwarfed by your own efforts. Not that I'm, necessarily that I think going bigger is a solution in a general sense. But I think it is one of those ways that you can start to have a slightly uncomfortable physical relationship to what you're doing. Collaboration, which I talked about in the carving the floors thing, that's another way that I think you just sort of upend a little bit of your own control and familiarity with what you're doing. Speed, that would be another way. Just doing things very quickly, I think sometimes is a great way to undermine. It just seems like we have to spend all of our time tricking ourselves, but it is really kind of part of the process. Changing states between 2D and 3D, for me, that's another way that I kind of upset a sense of balance. So in any case, with this piece, it was scale was one of the really learning parts of it for me, and time, because I made this piece very quickly, and with just a random sampling of materials that I found basically at Riverside Recycling and around the boatyard where I had my studio in Portland for a while. And it kind of came together with a certain sort of magic that I feel like I can't even take credit for. And I've learned that I think some of the strongest moments in my own work, they don't feel wholly like they were mine. And I see that as a really positive thing. Like when you can let enough of the sort of serendipitous parts of working into your own process, then authorship starts to feel very blurry. And I love that. I think that's so humane to feel that way in relation to what you make. And here's just a detail of some kids lying underneath it during the time that it was in the museum. There are a lot of elements, like the way the light came through the form I could have never predicted. The kinds of shadows that it produced, it was really, I wasn't anticipating. The way the light came through the plastic and almost made it seem like glass or some totally different material from a distance. It's all of those things where it felt incidental to a process that just kind of happened on its own. More recently, I've been really interested in working with clay. It's so different than the other materials that I've worked in before. These are a couple small slab-built clay forms that are smoked to give them that sort of black patina. And on the right is a collage made from scraps of an old woodcut. And I like to show this pairing because the collage came first. And I find that it's interesting how we normally think about 2D going into 3, or for me, in my process, mostly it's that I make a 3-dimensional form and then I'll do drawings from it and I learn from it. But in this case, I was making these collages that were so mysteriously kind of alluding to 3 dimensions, but not at all being representationally 3-dimensional or perceptually 3-dimensional. And I found that it was a really fun exercise to look at those flat collages and try to imagine the 3-dimensional form that would come from them. And so more recently, I've been doing, after doing all those kind of, what would you say about like my big hanging piece and the explosions, there's kind of an operatic kind of quality to those pieces. And I felt like I wanted to make work that was really intimate and quiet and personal and kind of private, and that's much more the kind of work that I've been making the last couple of years. I I think collage is another one of those ways in which you can, through making collage, is a great way to both use a bunch of scraps and kind of upend your sense of control. That first move of cutting out a shape and gluing it down and just committing to it, and then allowing a kind of process to unfold from a first decision to another, and really not knowing where it's going to go. I spent a couple of years doing a lot of collage work and finding that process incredibly instructive. Sometimes it's just as simple as cutting out a shape, but sometimes they would have many layers and, you know, evolve, kind of like a paint. I imagine a painting would evolve. I don't paint, but over time. Here's another project where I went from 3D to 2D. I had made a series of little kind of transparent, about the size of something that would fit in your hand like this, of transparent kind of sculptural ball shapes. But I had made them out of printout of dragonfly wing veins on a transparent film. So I was cutting, you know, sections of this film out and kind of taping it and forming these structures out of this printout. I just love the geometry of those veins, so it seemed like a natural material to work with. And then I would photograph them, and then I made cyanotypes from them, which is just a blueprint, basically. Yeah, it was another set of translations that seemed so circuitous, but somehow arrived at a feeling that seemed right. Let's see, a couple years ago I was living in New Mexico, and I had a chance, this is again a little nod to printmakers. Do you do lithography on this campus? Okay, that's great. So I was a visiting artist at the Tamarind Institute, which is in Albuquerque. And I have some of my ceramic sculptural forms on the table there, and then some stones that I was working on. And two of the finished prints that came from that series. So just to illustrate again the working back and forth between kind of creating still lives with ideas, sculptural ideas. And then very recently, this was last spring, I guess, probably April or May, I was making these paper forms that were, gosh, this went through a lot of shifts. I made a drawing, a striped drawing, cut that apart and turned it into this form. And then I made a series of prints based on the form, and then I cut the prints apart to make new forms. So it was like I was going back and forth between, this is now a printed dry point, that's the dry point there. And that would be cut up to make this. So this is made from printed paper. And I brought that and those prints if anybody's interested in seeing that in person afterwards. But again, this kind of churning, not really ever knowing where you should stop as you go back and forth, but going back and forth just the same. So a few simple shots from the studio and more recent work. Like I said, after doing a lot of those larger, sorry that looks terrible on the screen. After doing all those larger shows, I was feeling so much in need of a kind of quiet, working through much smaller ideas and giving myself the freedom to not be working towards these events, essentially, but just kind of growing more slowly. And so I had a couple shows this last summer, which I'll show you more images from, and pretty much everything in those shows I think reflects that much more quiet state of mind of more recent work. This is in my studio in Eastport. I was making a really big wire piece, or it felt big, and then the prints behind, you can see a much smaller wire piece on the wall over there. And these wire pieces I love for the way that they conflate 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions at the same time. They are themselves like a spatial drawing and a wonderful thing to draw, but are also, you know, very sculptural. And there's that one again. Making up a bigger one. they're just so different in motion. This is like a very, very choppy stop action, but you start to feel like what you learn from it as a spatial drawing, I think you learn when it's in motion, not when it's static. So I felt like I could just sit and watch this thing spin back and forth endlessly. It was just so satisfying. Even making this, I don't know if it's turning, like which part's in front, which part's is behind. It sort of eludes your understanding of it a little bit. And then the combinations of 2D and 3D, which you can see. Smaller, both ceramic work and some woodcuts.
Are the pedestals part of the work?
You know, I think the pedestals are like, yes,
Okay.
but it kind of in a funny way, because they definitely came later, and I don't necessarily think of those two ceramic pieces as needing to be with each other. So
Okay.
it's like two separate ideas, conjoined. Yeah, I don't know if it just means that I'm going to start carving wood and just forget the blobs on top. Probably. And this is David Wolf's big, huge letterpress in his studio, which is, I love printing on, with a sort of more recent wood block in there. Just to show you that fantastic tool. Have you guys visited Wolf Editions? Yeah.
We have recently.
Yeah. Great space. And then one of the funny prints that came from that. Again, trying to find ways to, you know, see the world both flat and in 3D, and that kind of push and pull between those two. I don't know why I find that so interesting. But anyway, so that represents probably the last year and a half of the kind of thinking that I've been doing, and in this way that our lives are always in flux and ever shifting, and you don't know what's going to happen next. I definitely am feeling kind of poised and ready for something like a larger commitment right now, kind of a bigger effort, maybe larger work. I'm not totally sure, but I feel kind of ready after recoiling into these sort of smaller pieces. I'm kind of ready to do something, which is exciting. But I wanted to, as the last sort of section of my talk, I've spent a lot of time in the last 5 years, like really deconstructing the art world and, feeling like I was trying to understand something about the machinery of it. And I realized that in the end, none of that really matters, as it turns out. So what I wanted to share with you at the end here is just a scrapbook of images. When I have a chance to cut up a magazine or find an image of something that I love, I grab it if I can. And I keep these things in binders. I have lots of them. And they're really where I go when I want to be reminded of how awesome making things is, and just a kind of pure positive feeling about artwork and what people do. That's so amazing, so inspiring. So I just wanted to quietly share some pages from that, because there's so much great stuff in the world. A lot of times I'll cut out an image and I don't take the time to find out who did it or that, but I'll just keep the image. And it's a combination of things that would be considered art and, things that aren't. But I think in this exercise of, looking around and grabbing things when they grab you, there's a way in which you construct kind of a portrait of your own interests this way that you wouldn't really be able to assemble freehand, like that you're interested in this and that, and, color and black and white, structure and surface, like all of these different qualities. Some of these are done by friends of mine. mostly by people I don't know. Some photographs. It's just yummy stuff, yummy stuff. Sometimes it's just like a color or just one aspect of an idea. But I find these binders so useful. So it's kind of like ballast or something for all the uncertainty.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you might use them? Do you go back into it, or?
It's just, a quiet moment in the studio, feeling depressed, stumped, loose ends. I don't know. It's just a way to kind of re-enliven the range. I think we get into our own little eddies and our little cul-de-sacs with ourselves and our work, and it's just like it aerates that soil sometimes to just remember, the world is there. So awesome. The things on the right are things that my kids have done. It's just so crazy. Someone said once that living with kids is like living with a drunk person all the time. Kind of true. In a good way.
How many binders do you have right now?
7 probably.
7.
I don't
How
always
long
come
have you been
across.
doing
What was that?
How long have you been kind of archiving?
Not very long. I would say 3 years.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, might have been part of my midlife crisis.
Okay.
I don't know.
Works.
Yeah, it's fun to go back to them. That mirror piece is so good, isn't it? Just love that. And I'm going to end my talk with a little bit of a non sequitur after talking about all these relationships between prints and forms and going back and forth and this whole kind of composting of one idea into the other. I feel like every once in a while there's just an anomaly that comes down the pike, like an image that is just stuck in your mind and it feels like it has no relationship to anything else, and you just have to do it, and that's what this print is to me. Anyway, a total anomaly that's not connected to anything in the world. It is just what it is, and perhaps that would be a brave thing to pursue more often, because I feel like when I'm working between 2D and 3D, it's like you have the comfort of kind of a call and response. It's not as much like being on the edge of a diving board as something like this is. So with that, thank you so much. Yeah, I'd be happy to take questions if you have any. Yeah.
How did you make the big piece that was in the museum?
It was, sorry, I didn't even talk about what the material was. It was sheet plastic and tarps that were cut into strips, sewn into grids, and then stapled together.
And the chrysanthemum?
Yeah, that's
Same thing.
plastic bags. Plastic bags taped and sewn together, and then all the seams that I did sewing were lined with tape so that it would be airtight. Yeah.
So Anna, you're just talking about like that, the comfort level and the piece in, making maybe just the piece in and of itself, and that maybe going back and forth is, I don't know, could get too comfortable or whatever, but
Yeah.
I'm wildly excited about that red piece, and it seems like with all these really interesting pairings that you've been showing us,
Yeah.
whether on the slide or multiple shots in your studio, that one really, it seems to me...
Are you talking, sorry.
The inflatable sculpture and the big red print.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, yeah.
It seems to me that would not feel that comfortable to be standing in between. I really wish I could be in that space and
Yeah.
experience that. And
Yeah.
that seems so rich and full of possibilities with the same piece. I think the scale being human or larger than human.
Yeah.
And I just love that kind of, when you're saying that messy, active breathing thing, and then this projected,
Right.
you know, idealized,
Yeah.
and that you're kind of splat as a being in between.
In between those two.
Yeah, just
It's
kind of
true.
wonder
Yeah,
about that.
that inflatable had a way of kind of pushing people to the wall, and then it
Yeah.
would deflate and people could kind of circulate again.
Yeah, it really
Yeah.
pushed that relation in a way that was maybe different than other
Mhm.
things. So just wondering.
Yeah. Yes.
When you get up in the morning, do you think about art immediately, or is that something that you come into as you kind of go out throughout your day?
Oh, if only you
waking
could
up,
see
or is
the
it-
gruesome reality of my life. I think about getting my kids out of bed and then getting them to school somehow every day. That seems like impossible. And then, and then I take myself to the studio where I'll probably have another cup of tea, and then I can start thinking. But, there's lots of logistics. It's not every day that you feel the freedom to launch into like an actual project. Sometimes it's just finishing up loose ends, making a birthday present for someone, and curating some prints that you just, printed and then ignored. And I just feel like there's all these other pieces. So in terms of that, but I do get myself to the studio where I regroup. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I'm wondering whether you're printing on two sides. Some of those prints, are you printing two pieces of paper and hanging them
Yeah.
back to back, or two sides of the same sheet of paper?
Both.
Okay.
In the example of the big red one, that was 2 sheets of paper, but the paper is very translucent, so they show through on each other. Other prints, it's printing on both sides.
So that cross piece that you
Yeah,
showed
there
us
was
at the
some
end.
printing on the back side of that one. Yep.
I have a question about maybe a little broader on your whole, even this idea of risk taking, and there's a safety net too, and this.
That's,
I'm just wondering about, because there's this really kind of broad interest in you, and you talked a little bit about this, the binded kind of infatuation papers and things you go to when you lock up, or there's some sort of a loss, and I'm wondering, because you have this really broad interest and you get infatuated with form, going from 3D to 2D. I mean, I'm almost wondering if there was a certain sense of interest in seeing that transfer into 2D again, like as in these images, like some of those comparative images of 3-dimensional form and 2-dimensional form in 2 dimension in the end. I'm wondering if, like, in your broader studio practice, do you find problem of sort of focus and curating what is actual work in the end?
Totally.
And do you use someone? Do you have a curator or someone that can help you kind of regain that? Because you do have really sort of sharp exhibits in the end, but you work in this very sort of loose. So also, like, that would be one, and the other would be sort of what's your success level? Like, do you lose work because you take these risks, and like how many of your wire sculptures you start, and do they all finish that successful?
Oh, right, yeah.
Etc.
No, good questions. I have a couple friends who I totally rely on to help me look at my work, but maybe once a year.
Yeah.
And then there's just the process of making things and having it sit in your studio, sort of pestering you day after day, and just at a certain point you feel like you know something about what it's worth,
Comes up.
And in terms of failures, all the time, like wire forms that come together that I end up totally cutting apart and trying to recombine and then throw away, or just this sort of process. But I find in the moments where I can remain the most loose in relation to what I'm doing, that there's less of that kind of fix driving it into a corner and having to cut it apart and do something else. There's something to be learned in a kind of light touch, or I don't know what. And sometimes I'll keep things around, even if they're total dogs, just because every once in a while there'll be something still to be gained from it, or it's like a material that is only an example there, and it's a material I'm still interested in, so I might come back to it. But I do feel really scattered a lot. Like, it's one of the things that's nice about working on a larger piece is that you just kind of focus into it, but then it feels so singular. You know, so it is a going between feeling totally scattered, like I'm on the Mongolian steppes or something, and then feeling like I'm just in a little room, like a cubicle. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, Anna, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I was thinking about the idea of gathering. Your work feels like there's a gathering of impossible, formless, invisible stuff, and I wonder too about, there's such a strong formal presence, but I can't imagine making that work and not feeling some metaphysical poetry in there, some narrative, some words that pop up. Do you feel the metaphor at all in language, or is it all formal and abstract in forms and textures and tactility and how it's going to defy gravity, or do you know what I mean?
I'm trying to think about how to
Like the
answer
idea
that.
of these things that interconnect.
Right.
You know, the metaphors within your work. Because
Right.
one can look at it purely formally and say, this is what's happening with the texture and the density and you know, all those wonderful 2D things. But what about, to me, there feels like a poetry to it that's
I mean,
buoyed in there.
I feel often, and I know I've said this before, so forgive me if it's a repetition, but when I do ever take the time to look back on my work, it never occurs to me to think like, where is this going? It's always the opposite question for me, like, what's the origin of all of this, you know? So I do feel like my work is hearkening more back to an origin than to a destination, and that there's something unknown to myself about myself that comes through in the work that I can't answer to. You know, it's just like I can only be beholden to my intuition in a certain way and trust the need to produce it.
That was so lovely, and one of the things that I've been thinking about, because I feel like I just learned a lot, and I think often about you and your work, and I think often like, what's going on with the nets? And I feel like I just sort of had a moment that comes out of this feeling of gratitude that you said to this group of people. You actually have to take risks, and I feel like that's a very counterintuitive move for artists right now, especially artists who achieve a certain level of professional success, that the notion of taking risks becomes infinitely more dangerous as you go on. And so for you to say, like, you can set up your life so that you can take risks, and that is how you move forward in time, I think is very meaningful. Yeah. So then, as I was sitting here looking at the nets, I was thinking, like, what's always interesting to me about your work is that you're halfway between thinking metaphorically between a body and a robot, or between a body and a machine. Like, it's very unsettled, the relationship between body and machine in your practice. And so I wonder, with regards to this question about origin or metaphor, if holding, you know, if the risk that you take is sort of continuing that question in different media, but never landing on body or machine.
Right. Oh, that's neat. I would have never put those words together. That's very interesting to think about. But I don't know.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
it's out there.
I really like that. But it does feel ongoingly unsettled.
Yeah.
It just feels like I'm pushing over here, and then I'm pushing over here, and then I'm going back over here, and I don't know if I want to be over here or over here. Really
That's
fun.
good.
Any other questions? Yes.
So, where you feel really unsettled and you have all of these different things going on, like, do you just kind of like take something and run with it, or are you trying to like consolidate a bunch of things together in like your big projects or your final pieces? Do you know what I mean?
Like how to make the choice?
Yeah. Like, I feel like that's the hardest, you know?
You're asking me such a hard question. Mostly I sit there in my chair in the studio and I feel paralysis. You know, and I just rock back and forth. And then maybe I pull out the binder I don't know. I guess sometimes it just feels like, I feel like whether or not I'm sure about this, I want to make a commitment to it and see what it does. So I guess there probably is more of a rational framework for it, but it feels a little bit arbitrary. But somehow in making the commitment, you learn about it.
Okay. So you do like end up picking something and like going with it. You
Sometimes,
kind of-
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like both that sort of scattering and wanting to be sure that I remain open to just the compost, right? But then every once in a while just saying, okay, guys, it's this. But even though I don't know if it is. You know what I mean? Just
Yeah.
forcing that kind of a commitment, I think, is a really healthy part. Not to do all the time, but for me, God, I mean, it's different for everybody, right? But for me, that's been true.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering what your interest in 2D, in the 2D medium was, because it seems like your work that's three-dimensional has like, I mean, I imagine for you looking at it, it's like, it's more interesting, it's like changing, it's
Yeah.
moving around.
Right, it's like non-static or whatever,
Right.
yeah.
And then it seems like you're interested in translating that to 2 dimensions, or
Yeah, I think sometimes it's like a distillation of some quality that a sculpture has that I think might be interesting on its own. Like what I was talking about in terms of like the tape joins on those inflatable ones. I was curious to see if those were interesting as sort of a diagram of decision making unto itself. Do you know what I mean? But let me say, because I didn't say this, and this I really wanted to be a talk about printmaking in a certain way, that the reason I like to draw in printmaking, I think has a lot to do with being kind of a sculptor and liking to have a struggle with materials. And when you're carving into something, or it's very physical, preparing a surface for print, and the physicality of the surfaces that you're printing always come through in your image. So it's like a sculptural way of drawing, if you will. So I think that's why printmaking has always been my preference in the world of 2D, because it has, and same with collage, like physically cutting a shape and pasting it down. It's like all very physical, the way that unfolds. And I think, just to answer your question maybe a little bit better, I love the three-dimensionality of things, but I love the flatness of things that allude to like a three-dimensionality. So there's something about the perceptual play that can happen in a two-dimensional image, very different than just a three-dimensional form, that I keep returning to. I think that's the better answer. Yeah.
You moved from Portland to Eastport?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
That's a pretty brave thing to do. What made you decide to do that?
Well, in brief, we were living away from Portland, though maintaining our home base in Portland for a couple of years. And I think when we kind of got back to moving back to Maine, we felt collectively as a family ready to land in a new place. That was sort of a good time to do that, right? And then my husband was starting a project, an alternative energy project up there. So all roads were pointing towards Eastport. There's a wonderful residency there right now for artists and some other things that are just starting to happen. So it has a pretty exciting feeling right now for both of us in our work. Yeah.
You talked a lot about like origin and identity, especially with your scrapbooks.
Yes.
Which is
Yeah.
something I'm really interested in.
Yeah.
And with processes like screen printing and sculpture and things like that, do you feel a sense of like origin and like identity and those like traditions of making? Is that part of your process in terms of it? Or is it just like a playful like feeding, like regenerative thing from like you had with your scrapbooks?
Yeah, I mean, I love craft, so perhaps that's a kind of underbelly to working with those materials and in those ways. I'm not sure that that's really answering your question. I don't think it's a clear sense of origin or anything, but it feels like I always lean toward in the same direction, right? towards either printmaking or physically manipulating some material. So I have to trust that that has something to do with my origin, which remains unknown. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah,
You've been an
thank you.
amazing,
Thank
you.
amazing.